Before I go into just a bit of an opening introduction, I'd like to read a statement from our state chairman, Andrew Radke. He said, "Greetings, brothers, wives and guests. A very warm welcome to all of you. Congratulations on successfully arriving at these celebrations. And as you know, we had to put them off last October, and it's been quite difficult to get the right dates and right times in these times. Some of us, mainly because of COVID, have not been able to arrive and are feeling devastated. State Council alone, these include Father Tom Kessie, our State Chaplain, Brother Vince Granahan at Ellering, Brother Neil Nolan Fay, Brother John Kaminsky and Spina, Brother Greg Wallace and Marge, Brother Nellen Fernando and Little Arthur, and Eddie, of course, and Moy. Personally, I feel like Moses wandering in the desert, never destined to reach the promised land. However, we are all certain that the celebration will be a huge success. I'd like to thank everybody involved who stepped up to the mark to assist in planning and organising these centenary celebrations. Thank you. May the Holy Spirit inspire every thought, word and action throughout the centenary celebrations. God bless you all. Our thoughts and prayers are with you, Eddie and Moy." So, unfortunately, Eddie was preparing for this, and I got a phone call on Tuesday to say that they definitely won't be coming, and could I step into the role. So
how's he coping with his
they are coming better now. I was quite worried Tuesday because they both got underlying health problems, but the last couple of days there's definitely improvement. So we're very pleased about that. So as Eddie said, though, we're very pleased that you could come. For those I haven't met, I'm Michael Gregg, and I'm the Deputy State Chairman of the Knights. I'd like to welcome Francis Price, Chairman of Southern Cross Care, our panel members, Dr. Phillip Good, Mr. Nick Mersiades, and Jason Ellering. Our brothers and wives from the state and the intrastate, especially Joe and Margaret Gugenti, who've come down from Ingham and to join us, and they've been helping to prepare us for tonight. So thank you very much, Joe and Margaret. I thank our sponsors, especially our major sponsor, Southern Cross Care. We've got Orden Minette, Brisbane, Archdiocese Development Fund, which most of us would know the Knights started many years ago for the Archbishop at that time. The Gleason family and Holy Cross Funerals. So we ask you to support them. As you're aware, we celebrate 100 years of the Knights in Queensland. We were formed on 28th of October 1921. For those that are around, in 2016 we launched the history of Southern Cross Care. Of the Knights of Southern Cross. We do the Southern Cross Care tomorrow night. And we actually asked Archbishop for a date he could launch it. And he told us 28th of October, which suited nicely in 2016. We then realised that he's going to launch it outside the cathedral, right beside the meeting place, our first meeting that took place 95 years before that. And we were hoping that we would have the 100 year celebrations about the same time, but that didn't happen. So I'll mention that Eddie won't be with us. As I've said, I've great pleasure in launching the magazine. And it's about mid last year, David Jeffries, our State Executive Officer, urged the State Council to approve to prepare a magazine and to celebrate our branches. Histories tend to celebrate wide things, and you've got to be careful it's not too big. But in this case, we've decided to make sure that we celebrate what the branches do. And so we've been able to do that because the branches are bread and butter. They're the on-the-ground doers, perform many unknown acts of service and fraternal care for people in the areas of operation. I think everybody here would understand that. Now, we've had books printed on history, as I said earlier, and we had the Jack Woodward book back in the 1980s, and then the Quest for Fair Go in 2016. The magazine touches on the state level, but primarily is a compilation of each branch and how each branch sees themselves in their history. So a great shout out to Mick Kelly. Where's Mick? Mick, stand up for a second. Mick went and got the history of the diocese, of the Toowoomba diocese branches, and I'm sure it took a lot of hard work. A lot of those branches are closed, but each branch did great work as well. But I thought what Mick did was marvellous, so thank you, Mick. And David Jeffers and Maureen Barley. Now, Maureen's a volunteer for the Knights, and she's done tremendous work now for about 8 to 10 years. And I can't speak highly enough of the amount of work she's done. She looks after our archives, and she's produced the displays we've got tonight, and we're around tomorrow. Maureen's currently in Toowoomba, where sister died, but she'll be back today, and we'll join us tonight. But I can't speak highly enough of the work she's did in researching, writing, editing, and layout in conjunction with our printer, Stan Montero. Stan's a member of Branch 2, and he runs Quick Copy at Stafford, and he has done he and his chap Andy have done the work to put the magazine together in conjunction with Maureen and David. So I think it's a great effort. And we're also grateful for the advertisers taking space. Branches were asked could they did some advertising for us, of costs, and we'd like again to acknowledge their assistance. I commend the magazine to you. It is titled 100 Years of Fraternal Service, Trust the Past to the Mercy of God, the Present to His Love, and the Future to His Providence, St. Augustine. So they'll be available now outside after this presentation tonight, and also tomorrow for $10 a copy, and I think it's good value. It talks a little bit about the history and some of the projects we've done over a period of time, but it is a good thing to be able to say we were there for 100 years, Centenary of the Knights. And we'll talk tomorrow about, it's now up to us to make sure that we move ahead in the new ways, make sure the Knights are contemporary, and we can succeed. So it is on to us to do that. Now, so I declare the magazine launched, and please support it. Now, I'll now hand over to Francis Price, who's going to introduce the panel. Francis is the chair of Southern Cross Queensland Limited. He's a former chairman of Branch 11 and joined the board of Southern Cross Care in 2002. Please welcome Francis.
There are 4 friends who used to catch up with each other every 10 years since they left school. They're all the same age, and on their 55th birthday, they discussed where they'd go for dinner. And they discussed for a while, and eventually they decided to go to a seafood restaurant. The food was reasonably priced, and it had an extensive wine list. On their 66th birthdays, they discussed where they were going to go for dinner. After a while, they decided they'd go to a seafood restaurant. It had a seniors meal, and the wine was also reasonably priced. On the 77th birthday, they decided, after discussion, they'd go to a seafood restaurant. It had a ramp, so the access was easy, and the food wasn't spicy. On the 88th birthday, they had a discussion, and they decided they'd go to a seafood restaurant because they'd never been there before. Which sort of leads into our topic about what happens as we age. We're very fortunate tonight to have three people who have a lifetime experience in terms of dealing with, in their professional life, what happens when people age. Jason Ellering, who's the CEO of Southern Cross Queensland, has got more than 20 years experience working in the aged care industry, in the for-profit and the not-for-profit world. His career started as a golf professional, so he's also very in demand to go to corporate golf days if people want to be a bit of a smoky. Nick Mersiades is the Director of Aged Care for Catholic Health Australia, and he's one of the foremost thinkers in terms of aged care in the country. He's worked for the Commonwealth and state governments in policy development and program management for residential and aged care, and he's worked for Catholic Health Australia, Healthcare Limited, Catholic Healthcare Australia since 2008. Professor Phillip Good is a specialist in palliative care. Phillip's a director at St Vincent's Palliative Care Unit in Brisbane, associate professor at the Mater Research Institute. He's trained across Australia as a PhD on effective-based palliative care that he got from the University of Adelaide. He's got a particular research interest involving palliative care patients, patient and carer experience, and palliative care for people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So I'd like you to welcome the three of them up to the table. Okay, I'm not quite sure whether you can hear me okay. So, interesting, Jason and I are bookending with ties. It's a long time since we've had to wear ties, and I was just saying that Jason, I went to, along with Steve, who's here tonight, to the Irish Club dinner the other night, and it finished a bit after 11, and so we were standing on a street corner waiting to get an Uber, and this lady came up to us, deciding to start talking to us, and the first comment which she made was how atrocious our ties were. I guess they get like that if you just keep them in the cupboard for so long that they become old. So what I wanted to do was just start off with a general question to all three of you. If you could each comment in terms of your own personal experience. We're all shaped by our influences, our experiences and our faith. So can you tell us what's informed your views about aged care, how it works, why it doesn't work, and where you think that your faith
and your influence more in terms of those views?
Who do you want to go first? I'll go first.
You open your mouth.
Okay. That's a fairly long question. I'll attempt at probably saying, for me, it started with the community. I grew up in country Victoria, so I went to a school in a place called Harkaway, for those who know what Harkaway is, but it's a small country town. I had 20 kids in the town, and community was about looking out for each other. So I think, a lot of my views have been formed through community. And look, when I talk about looking after each other, I think the old saying, it takes a village to raise a child. And I think it's such an important part. So I think my views get formed from aged care. The same is true for aged care. It takes a village to look after an old person. And I think one of the most important things with aged care, I think we should be seeing all the great work that happens in Southern Cross Care across Queensland. You think of the legacy the Knights have left. Our communities that we serve in make a difference to a lot of people. So we look after some 2,500 people across Queensland today, and we should thank people like Peter Bell who's in the room tonight too. The people have done a lot of good work in this organisation. So I think for me, my views started in community. Obviously went through, believe it or not, golf's a community. Sporting clubs are communities. It takes anywhere, church is a community. Everything where we go, there's a sense of belonging. And back to aged care, I was just talking to Nick before. Aged care is such a wonderful industry, but it takes a village, it takes a group to do it. And I think we should be doing it in partnerships, Francis. So my thoughts would be about partnershiping, community in this together.
Thanks, Francis. Well, I'm a country boy as well, so that probably has implications for how I see the world from a little town called Billawheeler, which you're probably familiar with. I guess the reason I've gone down this path is that from a very young age, I was very interested in the world around me and the people around me. I was a little nerd that would always watch Four Corners back in the 1960s. I was a little nerd who would always catch the ABC News, or only ABC. And then through university, became more and more exposed to the writings of very philosophical people who explain the Enlightenment and seeing the world around me. And that sort of led me to not the private sector, but to go to work for government on the basis that where we are today is we've got nation states. They've really complement the churches. And originally it was all done through the churches, and then we had taxation, and gradually governments become more involved in securing the welfare of the population. And I felt working in government and in progressive governments that had progressive taxation and provided services, that I felt that was where my niche would be. And that's what's led me. I've worked in a number of areas, providing services to the community, whether it's health or transport or whatever it is. And that's led me to, in the last 10 years or so, into aged care. And partly because we have a family experience going into aged care. So I've tried to do my best to secure aged care services in this country. But just picking up on what Jason said, it's one thing for governments to set the architecture of the system, but really where the rubber hits the road is what happens in each aged care home, or when an individual visits a carer in someone needing care in their own home. That's where the real benefit is delivered. So it depends enormously on the skill and the empathy of our workforce.
Thanks for that. Interestingly, I spent some of my childhood in Barra, which is close to Billawheeler.
Goodness. G'day, brother.
And somewhat similar to what Jason talked about, my father works for a mining company, but they're very involved in sports, sporting equipment, and I spent a lot of time as a young person being involved in sports and tennis and travelling to Billawheeler, and really interesting about community. I think that was something that was done a lot there. And then I think just during my career, and I guess in terms of faith, I was really, I always see it fortunate to work in an area where you can serve people and I guess live out your faith on a daily basis. And interesting, we had this talk about that. I mean, I really think faith is about this authenticity of living it out on a daily basis and how you treat people. And we had this board day the other day, and someone from the diocese came and said the church has got an authenticity crisis, and I said I don't think it has. I think just the actual institutional church does, and the healthcare doesn't, the social services don't, the aged care don't. I think that's where people actually really see the authenticity of the Catholic Church, and I think the more we are about service, and so it's Nepal and other service areas, which I think are really important, and I think I've just been really fortunate myself to have worked in, not so necessarily by design, but I've worked in Catholic institutions that I work with, and there's an ethos of caring for people. I mean, I think everyone has an ethos of caring, but there's a real ethos of this idea of caring for vulnerable people, and I think as we, everyone's vulnerable as we age, vulnerable, and I think I just really enjoy the privilege of looking after people as individuals, and I learn from everyone every day, and it's really interesting to me, aged care, and there's this really interesting thing in palliative care as you age, and if you live alone, and can you die at home living alone, and how challenging that is. So you don't have a carer at home, you have friends around you, and I'm just always amazed in the community. Like, people often talk about disintegration of community, but I see people who literally live alone. Some are married, some aren't married, some have lost spouses, some haven't had spouses, and yet they manage with family, with friends and other family around them to live in their own house until a lot of them die in their own house. And I actually find that really inspiring from a community point of view, and I think it's this, there's some image in society of disintegration of community and family is not always exactly what's happening for a lot of people that we are able to serve.
In fact, Nick, I went to school in Goode, and Nick Cuscully was in my class. There were lots of relationships. So another thing, getting back to that theory of community, or not so much a theory, the reality of community, and casting back this organisation's celebrating 100 years. And if we reflect over the last 100 years, there's been various ebbs and flows in terms of how community has evolved. Would you like to reflect on what you see those things that I'm not suggesting you've been around for 100 years, but how you've seen what happens in terms of that community change, and how you see, and particularly in the context of Palliative, where the Pope has outlined what he sees community as being, what you see the potential is in the future for reinforcing community. We'll start this end now.
Okay. I think somewhat similar to what I talked about before, but in terms of, I think community really, it's really seeing changes. I think, if you look back, I guess, the last 100 years, there's certainly a demographic of, there's an ageing population compared to now, compared to younger, and so there's a lot more younger people. But I think certainly when I was a child anyway, you loved being with your grandparents. They just spoiled you, you didn't have to do anything, and it fascinates me that it's the same for my kids now. They just, my youngest is a teenage boy who can be quite sour at times, and he goes to his grandparents and they say, "Oh, isn't he wonderful? Isn't he great?" And I think the other thing about it, as you age, I think for a lot of people there's just a lot more acceptance of life. There's a lot more acceptance of differences, and a lot more understanding of a variety of people. And I'm not sure how much society is actually changing. Like, there's different expressions of people in different ways, and it's great that people can do that in different ways. And I actually find that, I personally find that the aged people I know in my own family and community are actually very accepting of that in their own way. I mean, they struggle. I know my grandparents sometimes struggle to, like my daughter got tattoos, for example, and my mother and my mother-in-law could not get that concept of why you would want to do that. But they still have this underlying deep desire of love for that person, no matter what they do. And I think that's the great thing, is that trying to continue to have that deep desire of love for people.
It's a difficult question, really, because at first blush, looking around, you think there are a lot of forces out there which are running counter to communities, whether it's mobility of people, they're travelling all over the world, they're working all over the world, families are under stress, you're having marriage breakdowns that wasn't the case in years gone by. So there are those sorts of things which are negative forces. So, but I think the future is really about particularly governments supporting communities, whether it's Southern Cross Care or whether it's the Rotaries and all of these community groups that exist, because there's not just one community. There are a whole range of forms of organisations which can bring people together, and even things like getting involved with your local football team, your churches, your chess clubs. Those are the things that need to be supported, because they're the glue that holds communities together. Schools are very important in that regard as well. So we have to encourage people to be engaged with their schools, to engage with their local government, to be part of it, to be good, to be active citizens. I mean, that's how I see it. Now, there are pressures which are tending to pull those apart, but I think the innate urge of people to work together and to have companionship and empathy will overcome those if there's that support provided. And it's a case in point with, if I get to aged care, there's a lot of, there's a program called the Community Support, the old HACK program, the Community Support Program. Now, it's based on volunteerism and community-based organisations. There's a real risk, and the economists talk about that as being social capital. There's a real risk that if we move to a transactional system, that the government just gives people the money and they go and buy their services, that you will really lose something in terms of communities. But that's the sort of thing I'm talking about that we need to foster.
My thoughts on this, Francis, we talk about, is we are all human. So there's a great humanity about it. And probably as a 55-year-old, I've seen it change a lot around acceptance, and I think that's in diversity of acceptance as well. I think that's one of the things as a human sitting here amongst humans I'm most proud about. I think there's a strong sense of greater acceptance. Just yesterday I was up at Chinchilla doing an opening of a clinic up there for a group called Goode, who's an Indigenous group. And the work that they do to serve in that community is just incredible. I think there's some. I see us getting closer together. My fear on the other side would be social media. I think there's some real challenges for the youth today. I've got 3 boys of our own, so my wife, Simone, and I think community is around that social media. I think there's pressure. I think there's communication pressure on kids around what they look like, who they are. I don't remember that as a kid growing up in the bush. I don't remember that. I'm glad social media wasn't around when I was a kid. I could have been a lot more trouble. Exactly. So, and I look at our workforce, 1,000 plus, and I look there and 60% of our workforce are from overseas. Yet they're looking after people who are white. And there's difficulties. There's difficulties around communication. So I think the greatest thing we could do is to show compassion. I think, love, especially to our people, those who do the heavy lifting, the care workers. And I think there's acceptance, and the more we can work together as communities around accepting each other and growing each other, I think the stronger we'll be. I really do. That's obviously been the role of church. Church has been strong in that space. But I go back to some of the basics as well. I think, communities, we talk about Chinchilla and we talk about Taroom, that they are communities that Southern Cross works in, but there's communities within communities, but it takes people. And I think the thing I would also think about there is trust of bigger business as well. I think it's coming back more locally. I think there's a sense of, there's a spirit of community and people working together. And I've got great hope for the future around communities. I think we're in great shape, but it does take all of us together as humans to make this work.
So Nick, I was fortunate a few years ago, I went on a study tour over to the UK, Switzerland and the Netherlands to look at aged care over there, but one of the things that was really clear to me was that whatever the government policies shapes the way aged care looks in each of those countries. And the same is true here in Australia. So what do you perceive in terms of government policy and how that will affect the shape of what aged care is in the future?
I think where the government is going is to move away from the original roots of aged care, where we're just residential care, and the government said this is how many places we're going to subsidise, and whereas I think where they're moving towards now is creating much more consumer choice and control, not only in terms of the types of services that they receive, whether it's in a residential facility or an aged care home, or whether it's some sort of home-based care, but also to have a complete choice of who provides that care. It's not a case of, I can remember a Prime Minister saying to me not so long ago that we really have to have a residential aged care with occupancy of 99%. It has to be high, a bit like a hospital. Whereas that's not where I think the aged care is going now. It's much more about consumer choice and control, and which I think is a good thing. We've still got a fair way to go, but we're certainly moving in the right direction. And I think that sort of flexibility then puts an onus on people, providers of aged care, to be able to read and respond to individuals' preferences as to whether they want to be in a community, in an aged care home, and whether they want to remain in their own home, or whether they belong to a particular community, whether it's LGBTI or Indigenous, and they want their own small facility arrangement as well. So I think that sort of flexibility is where we'll be taking aged care in the future. So they'll see all sorts of different accommodation solutions for older people.
Phillip, you've experienced and journeyed with a lot of people aged care. What's that taught you about the human condition, and what's it taught you about your own mortality?
Well, time's short, that's the first thing. I think about that. I can remember when I first started in palliative care, it was very uncommon for someone younger than me to die. But even when I was a young doctor, I still had people younger than me dying, which was just amazing to me. And now a lot of people who are younger than me are dying. So you really see that your own, as your age, you see, the fact is that, and just I would see a lot of luck. I mean, people talk about dying, a lot of lifestyle choices, and sure, we all make our own lifestyle choices and that. But I just see some people I just think how did this person just seems right out of the blue, and it makes me very grateful of each day I have, and I don't think you can count on each day, which is interesting. That's the side we expect, expect to live to 100 or expect to live for a long time. And it reminds me of, I once looked after a 95-year-old, and they said to me, I must have asked them something about what he felt very sad and upset. I said, what are you particularly sad about? I said, I felt really cheated, I'm 95, I feel really cheated, I didn't get to 100. I'm thinking, my goodness, I don't know what the age I was, but it was a long way from 95. I'm thinking, gee whiz, if I got to 95, I'd be pretty happy. From that point of view, so I think it's taught me a lot about, about my own mortality, about the privilege of looking after people, about I learned from so much. I think what it's really taught me about is just what's important in your life, and it's interesting about I think just about the desiring happiness in the ordinariness of life, and I think that's interesting. The other thing about social media, people talk about social media, but these Instagram pictures of people going all this stuff, and I just, the happiest people I ever see are the people who are just able to enjoy the ordinariness of life. We all like the idea of the thought of going to Paris for the week or the weekend. You see people on Instagram doing this sort of stuff, which sounds great, and it is great, if you go and have that privilege of doing that. But just being happy doing the really ordinary things, and I just find the most contented people are just able to just be happy with just whatever's happening. And it goes back to this thing I was taught. One of the things I was taught early on was there was this guy who was the chief health officer of England, and he had this quote which said, "Your quality of life is the inverse distance between your expectations and your reality, and the closer your expectations and your reality are, the happier you are, or the better quality of life you have." And of course, we can't always change our reality, but we can change our expectations. And again, it always just fascinates me about people's expectations. So I guess just that really helped me to learn about being really happy every day about your ordinariness of life.
So Jason, you've constantly sought to engage with people in the aged care system, and having experienced it personally, Jason spends infinitely more time than you expect for a CEO just talking to people about facilities. And so, what challenges do you see in this system in relation to helping people build their best lives?
Yeah, the current system, if you believe the Royal Commission, let's say it was something that came out, the Royal Commission spoke about, the word was neglect that they used. I personally haven't seen that. I've seen there's opportunities for improvement, but I think my reflection on talking to people in aged care, regularly home care, aged care, retirement, it's typically aged care probably goes to Philip's point. Every day is a blessing if you talk to them, and they talk. You talk with residents and you talk about what's really important. They'll talk about life. They won't talk a lot about regrets, but they talk about the importance of today. The system itself, unfortunately, because of the compliance regime, will drag good people away from potentially doing the serving. Does that make sense? It's sort of like there's always compliance to be dealt with. So compliance is important. Governance is important. As an organisation, even as directors who sit here in the room and responsible for a big organisation, as I said, a couple of thousand people, we've got to make sure that we're doing that well. There's a real strong sense around quality. Also, reputation of a community, but every individual equals an outcome. What we've also done in terms of, from Southern Cross's perspective, was we don't just talk to customers, we talk to customers all the time. So we've introduced a program since I've been in Southern Cross as CEO, is a customer insights program. I think and this talks, we're on the phone and we talk to our customers every 3 months. We ring every family member, we ring every community member, we ring everybody in retirement. The thing I think, Francis, what it talks about when you have genuine dialogue and you listen to people, I think it's about listening. Imagine this, if we had 38 serious complaints, let's say it was 38, or somewhere around that, and today we have 0. And the only reason we have 0 complaints today is because we did what? God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, and it's to listen. It's just to listen to those. You can't always fix everything, but I think through a genuineness of listening, I think you can make a real difference. And so that's been a personal belief. I've had all the way through life. I learned that as you mentioned. I played golf, but I was a coach. I spent probably 13 years of my life coaching. And through coaching, especially one-on-one, you've got to listen to somebody. And as a doctor, and anything you're doing, so there's got to be empathy in it. There's got to be genuineness in what you're doing. And I think you can bring that through an organisation. So I love seeing our residents. I love talking to our staff, probably just as much, if not more, because our staff are the ones who do the caring. Because I don't do any direct caring as CEO. It's the staff, and I think the responsibility I feel every day is to love those staff and to give those staff the opportunity to do the best they can do. I think that's probably what I'll finish that up.
So Nick, in your experience, has Australia yet come to terms with what it thinks aged care should be in terms of providing for people if they get old?
I think it's a difficult question, that one. It's one thing to have it in your mind what you think a good aged care is. It's another thing to actually deliver it. I think the essentials of what constitutes good aged care has been understood by many people for a long, long time. The difficulty has been in the translation of that into what's happening on the ground. And I think the Royal Commission, and the fact that the government decided to proceed with the Royal Commission, has brought the whole community along in terms of improving aged care. I've never known, and also the whole COVID exercise has done an awful lot too, to put aged care into the forefront. And I've never known aged care to get the media attention that it has received in the last few years. And I think that has driven a lot of the governments of the day to do a lot more to lay the foundations for a significant improvement in the quality of aged care services in terms of choice, easy access, catering for those who are less fortunate, whether they're the pensioner communities or the Indigenous communities or LGBTIs or migrant communities. So I think, but there's still there's a long way to go, in my view, to actually take on, to actually implement the recommendations that came out of the Royal Commission. And I think one of the really big threshold issue is that the Royal Commission and the government's response has really put in place a system which is going to be quite expensive. And at this stage, it's not clear to me how that's going to be paid for. That whole issue was parked when the government responded to the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission recognised it was going to cost a bomb, and they talked about having Medicare levies or the like to get a dedicated stream of funding. Now that whole issue was parked. There's also a question of user contributions. That was parked, and that's a really big issue that we have to deal with. And the other thing is that we have to find the workforce. I said earlier, and we talked earlier about the importance of it really happens on the ground. It's the one-to-one relationship which makes good quality aged care. But I'm not sure where it's going to come from. And part of the answer to that is that the fact of life is that we need to pay people more because it's a competitive environment out there. There's the disability services, there are hospitals, there are all sorts of other areas that people can be attracted to. And one of the big issues then is to what extent do we rely on overseas workforce. And you mentioned that such a huge proportion. I hadn't realised it's quite that high. It's incredible. And the issue there is, are we doing the right thing by bringing skilled people from other communities to look after us rather than us looking after ourselves? That's a big ethical issue that has to be addressed as well. So I think we're getting there, but there's still a long way to go.
So, Phillip, I come from a Celtic background, probably like many of the people in the room, and one of the things in terms of death in essentially every nationality is a certain extent of ritual existing in the past. I mean, the tradition of the wake and those sorts of things. As that ritual has, in a lot of cases, disappeared, what impact do you think that's had on the grieving process?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We at my work, we have like a journal club where we get outside presenters come in, and each year, about twice a year, we get Tony Holland from Tony Holland Funerals to come along and talk to us about what it's like from a funeral industry and point of view. And I was really fascinated that he was saying recently that a lot of Anglo-Saxons don't even have funerals anymore, and it's really migrant communities, culturally linguistic diverse communities that actually are having sort of funerals and having celebrations afterwards. And I asked them what they thought about that, and they said, they all regret it 6 months later. They don't have a funeral, which is really interesting. They don't have a funeral service. They don't look at that, and they all regret it 6 months later. And I think it's also interesting to me. People talk a lot about going on to funerals and hearing things for the first time about the person, so you actually learn about the person and then they also hear about I wish I spent a bit more time with the person and got to know them from that point of view. So I think rituals. I think that's one of the things about society that we are losing a little bit. The idea of rituals. People try and get rid of a lot of things which they associate with something or other, but I think. A lot of religion is around rituals, and I think there's a lot of anti-religion in society, but what people don't realise is that the importance of this idea of culture is, religion is a cultural thing, and keeping the rituals, I think, around that. And I think within a family, we all remember, if you grew up in a family, you have your own family rituals, and they're very related to your family. And I look back fondly against my own family rituals, and I think it's really, really important actually for the grieving process, getting back to that there's a ritual of a funeral or a funeral service, and then, as you said, a celebration of life afterwards. From that point of view, it's a sort of a bad story about celebrations of life is that I've got a patient at the moment who had their own living wake, which I think is a great idea, and people do that now. Unfortunately, they caught COVID at that. So that was a bad outcome of that. But I think people really actually like the idea of this living wake. I don't know how that comes from a culture exactly, but at least having a celebration of someone's life, celebration of life, and it actually, the other thing about that goes back to the other thing about it makes people aware of their own mortality and just think about and reflect on their own lives.
Jason, getting back to sort of what we touched on before, but within aged care, one of the things that from my perspective, is a real struggle in terms of the way it's discussed is the relationship between clinical care and care. And they're not the same thing. Would you like to reflect on that in terms of your experience, your views?
It's a great question. So I go back 20 years ago, and I remember going back 20 years ago, and those who remember, obviously the start of Goode Village. Goode Village would have been a low care home, and most of those residents would have driven there, with their cars there. So it's a change, from a community perspective enormously. So my reflection is the change from clinical to home, and it's one that you think about. Is aged care a hospital, or is aged care a home? I think that's one question we should sit on and reflect upon. I was honoured to have lunch 2 weeks ago with Dr. David Gillespie, who's the National Party. He's in charge of rural health medicine. And I spoke to David, and we were just reflecting over lunch, and I said, he said, tell me about aged care, and I said, it looks like this now. He said, when did it become a sort of a pseudo hospital? And he asked me, he was interested, because typically, Peter Pell's, it's changed a lot. I think we've got to get back to home. my hope is we get back to home, and I think this is where it's quite interesting, Francis. You think of those living in home. If you have care services delivered in your home, are they more valued than care service delivered in an aged care home? Is there a difference? And it's an interesting question. When you talk to people who receive services in both areas, there seems to be a greater appreciation for care service delivered in your home as opposed to aged care home. And that's really something I've thought about for a long, this has been a journey for 20, I've been in this industry for 20 years. And I've seen it change, maybe move, if you've talked about a pendulum swing between clinical and non-clinical, if you could look at it that way. I think at times we may have got too stuck, but the acuity's changed too. The acuity's moved, there's definitely, people are staying home longer. So that means as they get to aged care, even though Nick could quote this better than I could, the length of stay hasn't moved, but the acuity's definitely increased. So you've got this expectation between great clinical care, which I think we should do, and providing that in a home-like environment. If anything proved that to be a challenge, was a thing called COVID. That was a real challenge. You think about a home that is not a hospital and is not the same environment. Gee, was that sort of point, that also created some challenges for us as well. So to maybe sum it up, I think you need both services really. I think you need great medical, leadership. I think you need great nurses, but you also definitely need a great home environment and what that looks like. So I think, I don't think I've answered your question. I think there's a tension between both. I hope we get back to really recognising, I think what Phillip, you spoke about earlier, was a good death. What does that look like in the end? How do you die well? So that's something we talk about a lot as an organisation, but what does it look like? So good life, we talk about grow communities where best lives are lived, but to the very end, to that last breath, it should be done with love and care. So my hope for aged care is we don't get stuck on either side. I think it needs to be a good balance. I think, Nick, you probably agree with that. Because where we are today, home care does make a massive difference. For those who are thinking about this, there's a great book called that was written by, I think his name, Dan Butler, but it was called The Blue Zone. And the Blue Zone spoke about the idea that to live your best life, and the Blue Zone was where the most centenarians lived in the world. And there was a secret to it. They moved naturally. They walked each day. They had wine at 5 o'clock. They had belonged to a tribe, so they belonged to a community. They had deep family. Another thing they also had was purpose. So to find purpose every day. And this was a longitudinal research done around where they live and what mattered. Nothing about clinical there, was there? There was nothing about was food as well. There was nothing about clinical. So I think we've got to try to think that we need great modern medicine to help us live our best lives. We need great nurses, but I think we've also got to find joy and love in the home too, especially aged care. I think is really, really important.
Well, my job's done. Now it's yours. So you don't get an opportunity to speak to such learned people that often. So anyone who would like to ask a question, please feel free.
Yes, Francis. Southern Cross Care is a traditional aged care institution, and they've got a lot of old buildings, some they've inherited in Western councils that are probably not fit for purpose, and there's got to be a transition to more homely buildings at some stage, and we've been lucky probably at Mergen getting Castro with something that's modern there, that's more fit for purpose. But how do you transition out of institutional, dead-looking buildings that aren't fit for purpose, that aren't homely, into something that's better? And how do you fund that without turning yourself into real estate developments and flogging off condominiums to pay for it? How do we get there? I've got my mother in a place called New Directions, and they've got a cluster of little houses around. There's not institutional buildings, and it seems to be going quite well. They're not locking the high dimension dementia wanderers up one end and locking them away and sedating them. They're sort of integrating it all, but it's hard work where they do that. How do we get to a loving, not so institutional environment to look after people?
It's a great question, and I think for those who have seen New Directions, it's really inspirational. It's really great. Francis, you spent some time over in Europe, and it's taken that model of small household models and made it into something that is definitely around community. So congratulations on putting your mum there. I think that the thing for us is to work out how we can partner with government, because especially in rural or remote communities, I might reflect there first up, and you spoke about the Western Downs. So we were fortunate enough in a thing called the Aged Care Approvals Round, which is an opportunity to ask for capital to rebuild. So we've got a service in Chinchilla called Lura that Southern Cross took on board. But that home would be fair to say it's gone past its use by date, and probably reflects a building that looks something like the one you were describing. So with the partnership with government, Nick's not government by the way, but has worked in government, we were granted $14 million. Not to refund, but as a grant. It was the largest grant in Australia in that thing called the Aged Care Approvals Round. And that came through, I think, the reputation of Southern Cross, but also it spoke about the idea of the need in that particular community. So as you sit down and you think about, models such as, so Andrew Spill is one of the architects who was involved with New Directions. So one of the things that came out of the Royal Commission, Nick, was the small household models, and about how do you actually create better homes for people to live in. So we've taken inspiration from that. So the home we built at Chinchilla, albeit, if I could say, the difficult time we're trying to build at the moment. For anybody who's been trying to build, it's tricky at the moment. We've had two of the largest builders in this country, closed down. But we are looking at, obviously, better models to create home and your best life. And so we are there, but there's a massive, challenge around infrastructure. Because I think if you go through all of our services, I was reflecting yesterday with a colleague in the car as we were driving around. Duick is now 10 years old, Peter. You're close to...
Not even that yet.
Not even that. But it's almost ready for a refurb, a significant refurbishment to get it back into what it needs to be. That's only 7 years ago. Then you've got to make sure, Nick, as you would know, you've got to have the financial wares to make sure it's even profitable, so you can actually go back and reinvest in this home into the future. So it's nice if you were starting today fresh as a brand new provider, a bit easier than starting with a legacy of older assets. But I think the question is we need to really work more, obviously keep working with government, especially in those regional areas, for access to capital, so that we can build those services.
Yeah, a lot of it goes down to a mindset. We just built aged care homes in the same model. We had, you've got dedicated architects who just do aged care homes, and they just use the same. Really, when you think about it, there was nothing in the building code or in government regulation that said you couldn't go into a small home type arrangement. The Abbey Field concept, I think it's called Abbey Field, something like that. Abbey something. I mean, that was around 20 years ago, and it was all around small design, small community type situations. So they're not new. And Hammond Care in Sydney has been doing it for many years. So, but because it was a very highly regulated system, where everything you did was controlled by the Aged Care Act, everyone did the same thing. And this issue is getting back to this clinical versus home-like. I mean, when, for the non-for-profit sector, it was hostels, and it was how many car parks would you build? It was very much how many car parking spots would you have? It was very much a housing solution. But the for-profits were running nursing homes, right? So the sort of the clinical bit where you got really sick, that was always there, but it was the for-profits that were doing it. And then they brought the two together, And the world is evolving now that people are staying in the same facility for longer. Not all. We're still getting a significant transfer from some homes into others because they've still got a hostile mentality or heritage to them. So this is all part of the evolution. And I think when I get back to this community choice, consumer choice and control, and providers responding to that, that's when that will be the incentive for providers to start thinking about, well, if I'm competing with home care, people getting their care in their own home, what have I got to do to get them into my aged care facility? And one of the, making it more home-like and more inclusive is one of the ways of doing it, and coming up with novel design. So a lot of it will go back to providers and their capacity to think expansively on what the community really values. Whereas that wasn't part of the equation for decades and decades.
Francis, my question is directed to Dr. Phillip Good and yourself. Topic equals voluntary assisted dying, or so-called, and palliative care. During that whole, I'll call it a process for legislation in Queensland around VAD, it seemed to me that the understanding of genuine palliative care was so low, and there are all these lobby groups and that just did not understand what good palliative care could be. So on one front, I just want a quick response about your thoughts on whether the VAD, I'll call it the debate, was properly informed. And then the second thing, Francis, I'd just like you to share with us the impacts you see on the administration of aged care, particularly with Southern Cross Care.
Yeah, I guess my response to that would be around that dying is a very emotive area, and I think that we like to think that our politicians make public policy thoughtful decisions, but for a lot of us in reality we make emotional decisions and then we get logical reasons for it to do that. So everyone's got, I think, people are fearful of dying and they're fearful of what it may look for themselves, and so they think that. So I remember, and one of the things I talked about at that inquiry, was about. I remember looking after a man who had. He was a young person, and this person, he probably was similar age to me at the time, maybe in his 30s or something. And he had mesothelioma, which is unusual to have someone so young. But his dad actually had died from mesothelioma, and he probably got it when their dad was renovating a house or something. He got it at quite a young age, and I asked him about his dad's death, and he said to me it was terrible, it was awful, it was terrible, and he was so anxious. And of course, he's short of breath, he was anxious, it's terrible. And it was really fascinating to me that his sister said to me afterwards, I was at my dad's death and I thought it was actually quite good. And so there's these two people at the same death and they see it so differently. And I think we all do that. Like, I see some deaths which I think are pretty horrible myself. I mean, there's a lot of deaths, I think a lot are beautiful, but I've seen some which I think they're pretty horrible, and I wonder if I wouldn't necessarily like to be like that. But the families just think it's fine and are okay with it. And we have our own perception of it, and so it's a very emotional thing. And another thing that happens when people are dying is, pretty much every day people ask me about, how long is this going to go for? This is terrible. And the person's just laying there peacefully. Like, the person's just literally laying there peacefully. They say, oh, they're suffering terribly. And I say, well, what do you think is the suffering happening? They say, oh, they wouldn't want to be like that. It's terrible. And again, dying is a really emotive experience. And so everyone has these conflicting emotions. And the conflicting emotion is that I don't want this person to die because I love them. On the other hand, I don't want them to just linger in the situation because my communication with them is gone away. And so, but it's actually very hard in the moment to understand those conflicting emotions, and all you feel is just awfulness and terribleness. And how can I think that? How can I think this? And so everyone has their own ideas about death and dying. And we all fear our own death to a certain extent. And I think it was really interesting to me that a long time ago, I went to a talk about courage and about the fact, it's a really challenging idea, but this person was talking about the fact that, you know, if soldiers are in a war and they run away from a war, we call them cowards. Do we ever think people are cowards when they're dying? But it's a really challenging thought. Like, what we don't think about is it's actually, I find everyone courageous when they're dying, to be honest. I actually find everyone courageous. I don't find any cowards. I just find everyone really courageous, because people start off with this idea like, you know, if I, well, it's a bit like, in some ways you can see the analogy of like, if I can't look after myself, I don't want to live. If I become paraplegic, I don't want to live. If I have to have something like my bottom, I don't want to live. But the reality is that for almost every person in those situations where they get their loss and disability, as you have a series of losses as you are aging and dying, you find a purpose and find a will to live. But there's this conflicting thing in societies about our own autonomy, and that I should be able to have complete control. And there's this fallacy of control, this idea that you know, we have control of anything in our lives. You know, we have little control of we actually have very little control. And the more you're comfortable with loss of control, the better the more you accept. But again, in society, we think we have lots of control. And so you have this whole conflicting things of emotions happening. And the other thing is, it's really hard to listen to people talk about their stories of genuine sadness and suffering of what's happened, and loss. And it is sad of loss. This came to me once when I was involved in someone who had a bad death experience at a hospital I worked at, and the executives had to listen to the person talk about it. And I listen to this all the time, not bad deaths, hopefully a bit of it, but just how difficult it is. And one of the things was they said to them we would meet again, and I felt really embarrassed that they actually never did. They never actually intended to, because they didn't like it the first time. They were never going to meet them again. But the people you look at the people on the inquiry, who are all very nice people, but they'd all made up their minds beforehand about which ways they were doing things, and people had predetermined ideas. And the other thing about it is that, again, you have this loss of control, you have this dying, and people think that there's a solution, and there's actually not a solution. And that's the, you know, people think for complex things there's a simple solution, and there never is. And so the idea is VAD will fix it. So whatever's happening wrong with dying at anyone, if you have VAD, it will fix it. And you know, it's really, and you had these people give, like a really great example would be, and I don't know him at all, but Campbell Newman talked about his mother died from dementia, and he wished that when he was primary introduced VAD, but there's no legislation in the world which would allow his mother, in her situation, to have had VAD. So was it about anything to do with legislation, or was it about the loss that people have when you're dealing with people with dementia? And again, it's just trying to get fixes for stuff, which is the complexity of life. So part of that's palliative care, part of it understanding dying, part of it I think is the emotion of it, part of it's the concern about our own courage. I mean, I don't know if people, I often see people and I think, would I be as courageous as this person in this situation? I often think about that all the time. But I don't know if we actually do think about that. You know, this man who has seen his dad die from the same illness, in reality he's thinking, will I be as courageous as my dad in the dying process, no matter what his dad looked like? His sister thinking, my dad actually had a good death. And, you know, I think you'll have a good death. So I'm not surprised that VAD's been introduced, because I see society now trying to get simple solutions for complex problems, and I don't think they ever work. But you see that all the time. And I guess the other fascinating thing to me was all the politicians were invited to come to visit, and a few did come and visit, and I talked to a few, and I remember one person coming, and they were great, and they actually said to me they thought that they didn't think it was good legislation, but their constituents didn't think that it was, so they'd probably have to vote for it. Fascinatingly, they voted against it, which fascinated me in the end for various reasons. And so, you know, I think you know, what we're faced with now is we're just faced with the same process of trying to look after people and trying our best to look after people. And the challenge, I think, in aged care and in Catholic organisations and in palliative care, the challenge is to think about this difference between, you know, often people think, oh, we've failed if this person decides they want VAD. But in reality, to me, I think what we need to look at is the process that we have. Like, it's not, the person in the end is going to make their own decision, but the process. Have we done our best care for the person? Have we given, have we listened to the person? Have we supported the person? Have we given them everything we think we can as the best care, whether or not they want VAD, because that's just a complete side issue to my thinking. And if they choose VAD, that's their choice. If they don't choose VAD, that's their choice as well. So it gets at sort of a long-winded answer to how I view it, and I just think it's very, people often talk about, you know, why couldn't you change their minds? It's very hard to argue people out of an emotional position, and the reality was, it's really impossible to argue politicians out of an emotional position. That's my thoughts around it.
Thank you.
Just in terms of my experience of the process, where the legislation is pushing us in terms of the society, and also then where it sits in terms of aged care. And so this legislation has not been driven to help the dying, it's been driven to help the living. And Philip's comment about people have a view when they see a relative die that they should be able to end their pain. And literally the chair of the committee expressed the view that he had a nudge with a clinician at the time of his mother's death, and that was okay. And your comment in terms of dementia, I mean, the minister who introduced the legislation gave a very tearful speech, and I'm not questioning what was heartfelt, but about how she also wished this was here when her mother was dying of dementia. And so the misunderstanding about that is, I think, really disappointing. And like I say, it's about people's emotions when they watch someone else die, not necessarily for what someone die. In terms of the issue of palliative care with the AD, my real concern is that this drives people towards BAD where we don't have palliative care. I mean, the Palliative Care Association identified a number of 175 that would be required to have universal palliative care across Queensland. If you're not in South East Queensland and a selected few regional locations, the reality is you don't have effective access to palliative care. And so if you're faced with no palliative care and bad, then you will find, as they found in Victoria, the numbers who are seeking bad in regional areas are much higher on a percentage basis than they are in metropolitan areas. And so from a policy perspective, what you're doing is you're creating an environment where the option of bad is preferable because you don't have an alternative in terms of effective palliative care, which is, you know, to me, one of the real policy issues associated with that. Where it fits in the aged care environment, there are a number of really onerous components. The number one component that really worries me is if one of our staff is charged with a criminal act. And so there's an element in the legislation, and I'm sure it was one of those, oh, we've got a smart solution. So in the discussion about whether people should be enticing or encouraging relatives to go ahead with bad, I'm sure the people who are supporting bad says, well, what happens if people try to stop them? So in the legislation, there is an element that says if you encourage people to go ahead with bad, or if you discourage them to go ahead, it's a criminal offence punishable by 7 years in jail. So if one of our staff, in terms of trying to provide effective palliative care, has a discussion with someone who is along the bad process, so that kicks in as soon as someone starts the process. So if one of our staff has a discussion, and then you get someone come in who hears that discussion, they can refer them to police as committing a criminal act. And so for me, that is really one of the things that will be really challenging, because, you know, from my point of view, how do you then protect your staff? So are we to say if someone's in our facility and they're choosing plaid, but no one has to declare that, but if our staff member says the wrong thing, that's said by the wrong person, albeit I think it would be very hard to actually convict them, they can be potentially charged by police for performing criminal act. So that to me is one of the real problems, and Queensland is the only legislation that does it. The other components are the fact that no one dies in Queensland from that. So what appears on your birth certificate is your underlying condition. So you are not deemed to have been given a drug, and just one of the really other main policy concerns I have is administration of a drug to kill you is not a medical procedure. Yet it's been written in such a way as it's deemed to be a medical procedure. One of the interesting things I think will be that the Deputy Premier said that if a physician fails to follow the legislation, they'll refer him to APRA. I'm just interested to see the AMA case supporting that person who says prove your system medical procedure, and therefore that APRA has any requirement to enforce anything in terms of clinical requirements for someone who's not following a medical procedure. But that'll be interesting in terms of if that plays out the way it does. The other thing is, because it's not required to say that someone's died of administration of a drug, we can have someone die in our facility. If someone dies in our facility for a unknown reason, we're required to refer them to the coroner for investigation. There is no requirement for the person who has administered or provided the drug to do anything other than provide within 2 business days to a state government authority advice that a person who has given the drug has died. And there's no requirement of that authority to notify us of that. So we can go through a process of notifying the coroner, having to deal with the relatives who've had an unexplained death, because there's no requirement for any relative to know about that. And that can literally tie us up for 2 weeks or more, or an undetermined period, where we are the ones who have to literally clean up the mess. And so that's, they're my, regardless of bad or not bad, just those purely functional issues in aged care are going to make it incredibly difficult for us. And that's outside of the issue of traumatised staff experience in Western Australia, in the Southern Cross side over there, where someone chose on the day, the first day that they could do it, to die because of that, and I've had staff members who've been up with mental illness as a result of it. And in any other workplace environment, if someone comes in and creates an unsafe work environment in terms of mental illness as well, then they're investigated. But there seems to be nothing to recognise the impact in terms of staff members. So I can't tell you how we're going to deal with it. We've got 12 months essentially to work through that process, but there are a number of underlying problems in legislation, and Queensland is far more punitive and onerous than the rest of the country.
Frank Duff from the Deep South. Changing the subject slightly with respect to immigrant nursing care, staff care. Is it a societal problem? Is it our fault, white Australians? Are our daughters and sons, our granddaughters not working in aged care? Is it because the pay rates aren't high enough? Or is it because we confuse service and civility? Do we look down on people giving care as being servants? Is it a societal thing? Not a question, just a thought.
Oh, look, it's a great question. I think aged care workers are the unsung heroes. They're like angels of our communities. And I think anybody who does caring, especially in life, is so worthwhile. I think potentially we've got a PR issue with it too. I think it's probably not as well understood as it could be. I don't think we celebrate it enough. The conversation tonight would be something where you could actually celebrate the importance of aged care. I think pay rates are definitely an issue for the industry. We'll talk about the fair work piece that's happening. there's definitely, from Southern Cross's perspective, we've been, as from a board perspective and an organisational perspective, trying to move our organisation at the very top to recognise and value our staff, you know, through better wages and pay conditions. Mike Hart's here tonight, who's been driving that, and his team, and we're really proud to say that we've done that. So pay's only one part of it, but it's also culture. It's about, you know, what the organisation is. It's about the culture of the community and how much we value it. I think aged care workers are incredible. I think we're having some real success with younger people too. So some of the interesting stats that are coming through at the moment is a real number of younger people coming to this sector, which I think is really encouraging. So I'm hopeful that we continue to create a, you know, an environment where younger people want to come in, old people want to come in. We've got to, you know, have an environment where you're valued for what you do, you're well paid for what you do, but most importantly, you've got the right culture and leadership around as well.
I think it's a mixture of what you raise. It is a cultural and societal issue, but you know, you ask yourself the question: what is driving that attitude? And I think that comes back to one. It's the reputation of the aged care sector. I mean, the Royal Commission has done untold damage to the sector's reputation. You know, it's called neglect. Fortunately, in some respects, the COVID has improved community respect for frontline workers, but on the other hand, the frontline workers themselves have really copped the beating because of the working conditions they've had to work in, and that partly gets back to salary as well. There's no question. I mean, remuneration is a very significant motivator in any situation, and there's no doubt that at the moment personal care workers and nurses, compared to their hospital compatriots, are underpaid, and I think that plus the reputation of the sector makes it very difficult, and this is one of the big areas where there's unfinished business, in my view, in terms of the Royal Commission and the government's response to it. And that is, it really hasn't addressed the workforce issues, and remuneration is part of it. Now, there's a wage claim at the moment before the Fair Work Commission, but you know, the government is sitting on its hands. It's not supporting it. It's just simply providing information if it's required, if it's requested. And even the opposition, even though they're prepared to put in a submission to the Fair Work Commission, they haven't indicated how they're going to pay, whether they will pay for it and how it was to be paid for. That gets back to my earlier comment about, you know, we're creating this dubious system, but how are we going to afford it? So there's still a lot of unfinished business to be dealt with.
Just at that point, the organisation has a statutory duty to comply with the awards. So if the Fair Work Commission varies the awards to raise the pay rates, the organisation would have to pay in accordance with the award. Now, the politicians would have no choice other than to assist. Because, well, the alternative is we all go out of business. You can't have people that are not paid in accordance with the awards. So the money's got to come from somewhere.
Well, yeah, that's one way of looking at it. From the government's point of view, who are looking at every dollar, they will say, well, you just need to do a bit better with your productivity, and we'll fund you to 80% of it or 60% of it or something like that. So it's a risk area for the providers, and I don't think you can assume that the government will step in 100% to meet the cost. It doesn't work like that, because the other thing is that you've got a spectrum of performance outcomes across the sector, from those who are doing EBITDAs of a couple of thousand per resident per annum to those who are making losses. And the government will say, well, you know, the top end can afford this, why can't you? You need to lift your game. So it's a very murky area, and I think, you know, this is where the sector overall is sort of saying we're pushing for government to sort of to come to the party and say, yes, we will fund it. But the government is saying, hang on, I'm setting up a independent pricing authority, which is going to do costing studies. And the question is, are they going to set the prices on average costs, or are they going to set it on at the efficient end? There's a lot of flexibility in there, which creates a lot of anxiety, and that's why the providers haven't come out and said that we support a 25% increase or whatever it is. They've simply said, there's a workforce problem and there's a work value issue that has to be addressed, and the pressure and what they're looking to do is put the pressure on both the major political parties to come to the party and fund, but we don't have an answer on that.
Spoken like a true former union lawyer, Brian. Just in terms of...
You better hope for a big pay rise, because that will force the politicians' hands.
Just a few points. In terms of, one of the positives about the younger workforce is they look for a purpose in terms of the roles they choose. And so as an industry, we are well placed to provide that purpose. But the issue in terms of pay is significant, because the money that can be paid in the NDIS world compared to the aged care world, there is a significant gap for essentially doing the same role. So as a home carer in the NDIS world, you are earning 30s, 40% more in terms of that space than you are in the aged care world. So that provides a real problem. One of the other things that we face as a society is an ethical problem. That discussion or comment that Jason made about 60% of our workforce being Asian, South Asian, non-Australian, it really hit home to me. We were doing a lot of work in terms of our strategy during COVID, which means we were living on Zoom. And on a Zoom meeting, there were 25 faces on the screen, and there were 2 Caucasians. And so that's now the reality of our workforce. But the other side is the third world is suffering from a lack of people in terms of clinical training and medical training. And as an ethical issue, is it right for the West to suck all of that resource out of those third world countries to satisfy our need? So, it's a wicked problem in terms of solving, and there is no right answer. Sorry.
Carmen Reeves, my name, I'm from Victoria. One thing the Royal Commission has done is that in Victoria we've had to revamp a lot of our, refurbish a lot of the facilities that we have in Victoria. And what we're finding is that the prices to get into the homes, which on average pre-COVID were probably around the 400,000 mark, today it's closer to 600 and 650 to get into the facilities. That's point one. Point two, we're finding younger people are going into working as workers, but they do move a lot quicker because they want more money. And until we start paying the same as close to what the NDIS can pay, we're going to be behind. So I know it's a hard thing, but the closer we can get the wages, that would I reckon would solve a big problem.
Yeah, it's just not the NDIS, the personal care workers type comparisons. It's also the nurses.
Yeah.
And what their pay rates are compared with hospitals. And there's a very strong argument that an aged care nurse has a much greater span of responsibility than a nurse in a particular ward dealing with, with a narrow, with a particular episode of care. It's more narrowly placed. Whereas a nurse in an aged care home is looking at the whole spectrum. It's all about infection control. It's all about medication management, all those sorts of things. It's much broader.
So we're just about at an end. I'll just make one other comment on that. A lot of the discussion in this space has been about ratios, and we can discuss whether ratios are being driven by the nursing union. But one of the interesting outcomes in Queensland where they've introduced ratios in public hospitals in certain wards. That sucked nurses out of their sub-acute wards into the acute wards, which has meant they've sucked nurses out of aged care into those spaces in the acute wards. And so all ratios in Queensland is suck nurses from those areas that are paid less in the areas that have got ratios. Queensland Government made it mandatory for every state government aged care facility to have nurse ratios in place by sometime in February. None of their facilities met their ratio requirements. And so, you know, reality is they can't manage it themselves. One last question.
Have we forgotten when Cardinal Fancy closed the schools in Goulburn? It's a long while ago, in the southern state, in order to get state aid for schools. If you truly believe that your staff are angels of mercy and are worth more money and they ask for more money, you should support it, but tell the government that you might all go broke. So either the government or the community has to step in. Why should these immigrant staff be paid less and yet be angels of mercy?
Well, I think we don't need to tell the government because they know that 70% of them are going broke at the moment. But one last comment.
You asked a great question about the cost of going into aged care. I think that's a really interesting one, and maybe, Nick, we haven't spoken about how do we fund this, and there's been a couple of comments about that, but I think, I might have this wrong, but the average age of going to aged care at the moment, Nick, I think is 83, 84, somewhere in that number. Of the population who are 83, 84, this number, just hold it, might be true, but it's somewhere in that percentage. They 90% of them own their home outright. So there's a massive amount of unlocked potential capital sitting in that sector. The question I think we should talk about at some stage, not tonight, but it's about how do we actually fund it. I think that's going to be the real thing about how do we actually fund this to improve the wages conditions for the people doing the heavy work. And again, a community is about, if we come back to that one thing about a community, we're all in this together because we can leave a legacy of debt for our future generations, not our own grandkids, their grandkids, that we want to make sure that it's fair for everybody. I think that's what we should do.
On that, I'd ask you all to thank our panellists this evening.
Thanks very much, and I'll call on Brian Kilmartin some further thanks your audience.
Contrary to the rumour, Mr. Price, I'm not advocating pay rises.
I'm just talking about your former masters.
Other than saying, of course, it is the duty of the church to support employees being paid just for remunerations. That's a fundamental consideration regardless of what else might want to do. Mr. Price and distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be asked here today to post a vote of thanks. The fact that there are so many people here, the fact that our organisation has been so active for so long a time, is a very fitting testament to the seriousness with which this aged care sector is taken. The Knights of the Southern Cross, through the organisation known as Southern Cross Care, has for a very long period of time been obedient to the scriptural injunction to honour our fathers and our mothers and to honour the head of the aged man. We're specifically commanded to do that in the scriptures, and we should be proud of the fact that we are doing just that. I noticed on the ends here, my late father and Dom, of course, were involved in Southern Cross Homes in Queensland when the initial facilities were started. And I think that we should all be proud of what has been done. It is true, as someone said earlier, that the church does get bad publicity for a whole range of reasons, and you have to just make the best of the worst of that. But I think people see beyond that. A lot of the allegations of sexual abuse are historical in their nature, but people can look beyond that. They can see the practical work that the church does in its hospitals and its aged care. The church should be proud of that. The church is just not the structural church, but all of us who constitute the church is something that we can look up to and say, well, we are doing something to help people at a very difficult stage of their life. Archbishop Rush was a great supporter of Southern Cross Homes in the early days. I well remember a sermon he preached many years ago after a celebration of this kind, when he said it this way, that you must be an industrious organisation in the Knights of Southern Cross and Southern Cross Homes, because if you weren't, you wouldn't have asked me to incorporate into gospel tonight. You would have asked me to read out the Passions of the Gospels about the man who had the 5 talents, and he invested them well, and he got even more and more things for his trouble. So you'd have to say that looking at the last 50 years of operations, taking that as a fairly nice time span, you'd have to say that those who've had the responsibility of shepherding Southern Cross homes have certainly taken notice of what Archbishop Rush said in his sermon about being given responsibility to do things and taking those responsibilities further to improve things even more. So we should be all inspired of what we've done in the past, but not bake in that glory of due boasting, but have it all merged into love of God, realising of our obligations and take matters further. We're very lucky tonight to have so many distinguished persons on the panel. We've had clinicians, we've got a clinician, we've got a civil servant, we've got someone who's actually running our state institution for us. We're privileged to be informed about what is going on in a very difficult sector at a very difficult time in Queensland, particularly with the voluntary assisted dying. So I congratulate and thank very much those speakers for giving me their time tonight. I congratulate all of you really for coming along tonight to listen to this. And I would congratulate, of course, Mr. Price for the hard work he's been doing, particularly during the currency of this so-called voluntary assisted dying. So I think we can put our hands together to make the presentations. I think there might be a bottle that I'm sure the guest speakers will stay behind and share it. At the end of you asked them nicely. Who's
Thanks very much, Brian, those words, and I endorse his comments that we're very lucky tonight to have such a well-credentialed group who bring us up to date. So without further ado, I'll close this, but I do ask ladies that are going on the ladies program tomorrow, they can either meet here, outside this room, have a cup of coffee before they go, or they can meet at the cathedral at 9 AM. So those that come here will walk down there. So if you are going, please enjoy it, and see if we bright-eyed and push a car tomorrow morning at 8 AM in this room. So thanks very much.